Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. It was late. The house was quiet, and the only sound was the low hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. I reached for the switch beside my bed and turned off the light. For a moment, the world disappeared into darkness. My eyes adjusted, and everything became blurry. I tried to settle, to drift off to sleep, but then I saw them. Two small glowing dots, far too bright to be a trick of my eyes. They were just above the floor, no higher than the height of the bedside table. At first, I thought it was my eyes adjusting, playing tricks on me. It wasn't unusual for things to look strange in the dark. But these, they didn't blink away like normal reflections or light spots. They stayed there, unwavering. I stared at them, trying to convince myself it was nothing. My breath slowed as I let the silence settle again. It's just the dark, I told myself. Just your eyes getting used to it. Then, they moved. Just a little. One of the dots shifted to the side, and the other followed. Slowly, deliberately. I froze, unable to move or look away. My heart started to pound as I tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was just some dust reflecting the streetlight outside, or maybe the glare from the moon was playing tricks. But no, they moved again. A deliberate movement. Then, the dots, they blinked. For the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't alone. I wasn't in the quiet solitude of my bedroom anymore. Something was watching me. I sat up in bed, the blanket still clutched tightly in my hands. My mind raced through the possibilities, none of them making sense. I couldn't tell if I was dreaming or if this was real. The dots blinked again, faster this time. Then they shifted closer. I could feel the air around me growing colder, as if the dark itself was drawing closer, inch by inch. I stared, frozen. The little points of light had grown larger, now unmistakably looking like eyes that stared directly at me from the dark, not just a figment of my mind. And then, I heard it. A faint whisper, almost inaudible, like a sigh from deep within the dark. I could feel my heart race faster now. I had to move, to get out of that bed and run. But where would I go? How could I escape from something that wasn't supposed to exist? The whisper turned into a soft giggle, barely a sound, but it echoed in my head. I pressed my hands against my ears, trying to block it out. But it was everywhere, in my mind, in the air, in the dark. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut, wishing it would go away. But when I opened them again, the dots were closer. Much closer. And now, I could see something else. Shadows began to stretch across the floor, long, twisted shapes, moving in unnatural ways. They curled and shifted, but the eyes, they didn't move. They stared. My heart was pounding now, a heavy thudding in my chest that drowned out the whispers. I could feel the coldness spreading, crawling up my spine, as the eyes in the dark continued to gleam, unwavering and unnervingly still. The shadows around them began to take form, slowly shaping into something that wasn't right. I could barely breathe. I wanted to scream, to shout for help, but the sound got caught in my throat, strangled by the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. My hands trembled as I reached for the lamp, hoping, no, praying that the light would somehow break whatever was happening. But the lamp, it was just out of reach. The whispering grew louder, more distinct now. I couldn't understand the words, but they felt like a pulse in my ears, pushing against my skull. The giggle came again, that soft, disembodied sound curling around the edges of my mind as if mocking my fear. The eyes, those two tiny, glowing points, shifted once more, slowly rising off the ground. They were now level with my face. And that's when I saw them more clearly. The pupils weren't round, not anymore. They had elongated, stretching into vertical slits like a cat's eyes. But there was something else in those eyes. Something wrong. It wasn't just the shape. It was the emptiness that echoed from them like a void swallowing everything around them. I blinked, trying to refocus, trying to tell myself this was just my mind playing tricks, but my thoughts were clouded by the growing sense of dread. The shadows surrounding the eyes began to crawl toward the bed. The floor beneath me creaked, unnaturally loud in the silence, as if something was shifting beneath it. I could almost hear the faint scratching of claws dragging across the wood, but when I looked down, there was nothing there. Just the empty floorboards stretching away into the darkness. And yet, the shadows kept moving. I turned my head toward the door, the one I'd locked earlier, certain that nothing could get inside. But now, the door frame seemed different, warped, as if the very air around it was distorting. The dim light from the hallway outside flickered and blinked, casting distorted shapes into the room. I knew I couldn't stay here, not anymore. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. The eyes were still there, hovering in the dark, but now, something else was watching too. I tried to pull myself together, to think clearly, but the panic was too much. My hands were clammy as I fumbled for the phone on my nightstand, praying it wasn't too late to call for help. But the screen was black. It wouldn't turn on. I tried again, pressing every button, but it was as if the power was drained from it entirely. A sudden crash from downstairs made me jump, my breath catching in my throat. I instinctively wanted to bolt for the door, but the air around me felt heavy, suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, as if the room itself was shrinking. The giggling came again, louder this time, closer, almost right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there, just the suffocating darkness and those damned eyes, glowing faintly in the corner of the room. I felt a cold hand wrap around my throat, not physically, but in the ear, tightening like a vice. My breath became shallow, panicked. I couldn't breathe. I was suffocating, my lungs fighting for air, but the pressure wouldn't release. I stumbled off the bed, my legs barely able to hold me up. The floor felt uneven underfoot, like it was moving beneath me, rippling like water. I reached for the door, my fingers trembling as they wrapped around the cold metal knob, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked. I knew it was locked. I'd made sure of it earlier. I pushed harder, desperation flooding my veins. I needed to get out. I needed to escape. But as I pushed, I heard the floorboards creak behind me, slow and deliberate. I spun around just in time to see the eyes, now larger, stretching into the shape of a face, emerge from the shadows. The figure was almost human, but not quite. The face, while it seemed familiar in some twisted way, wasn't right. The skin was pale and stretched too tightly over the bones, as if something had molded itself around a human shape, but was still learning how to act like one. It moved then, too fast, much too fast. Its limbs stretched unnaturally, jerking into position, its long fingers curled like claws. The giggle turned into a low, guttural chuckle that rumbled from deep within the thing's chest. I froze. My mind screamed at me to run, to do anything, but my body refused to listen. I was paralyzed, unable to escape the cold grip that seemed to be closing in around me. The figure stepped forward, and that's when I saw it more clearly. The eyes, they weren't just eyes anymore. They were holes. Holes that led nowhere, just blackness, infinite and consuming. I could feel myself being pulled into them, drawn closer, my thoughts slipping away as the dark emptiness took hold. The whispers turned into words, soft at first, then louder, as if they were speaking directly to me. Come closer, and you'll see." The door still wouldn't open. The shadows were everywhere now, swallowing the room whole, pulling everything into a place I couldn't understand. I was trapped. And then, just as suddenly as it had all started, everything stopped. The figure, the eyes, the whispers, they all disappeared, leaving only silence. I collapsed to the floor, my hands shaking, my heart still racing. I didn't know what had just happened. Was it real? Or had I just imagined it all? But then I saw something on the floor, something that wasn't there before. A single, broken piece of a bracelet. The same bracelet I had lost months ago, the one I'd left in the woods, the one I had sworn was gone forever. It lay there, cracked and tarnished, as if it had been waiting for me to find it. I stared at it, my breath shallow, the weight of the darkness still pressing against me. Had I really escaped? Or had it just been the beginning? I couldn't tear my eyes away from the broken bracelet. It lay there, glinting in the faint light that bled in through the curtains, as though it had always belonged here, in the center of this room, next to me. My fingers, still trembling, reached down to pick it up, but the moment I touched the cold metal, I recoiled, as if it had burned me. What was happening? The room felt foreign now, as though the walls themselves had changed in some subtle way, closing in, pressing against me. The familiar sound of the house settling, the creaks and groans I'd ignored 1,000 times, was now deafening, each one like a whisper from something just beyond my sight. The silence that had followed the disappearance of the creature was anything but peaceful. I stood there, rooted to the spot, my mind whirling. The whispers were gone, but the feeling of being watched had never left. I could almost feel the weight of those eyes on me still, the warmth of their gaze even though the creature was no longer there. My thoughts raced, my pulse quickened. Why had it left me alive? I looked at the bracelet again, now holding it tightly in my hand. It felt wrong, like a piece of something that shouldn't exist. But that's impossible, I thought. I had seen it disappear. I'd left it behind. And yet here it was, in my room, in my hand. There had been no sign of it when I came back from the woods. A soft tapping sound interrupted my spiraling thoughts. A gentle, rhythmic knock. It wasn't coming from the walls, but from behind the door. I jumped, my heart leaping into my throat. The knock came again, softer this time, but unmistakable. Something was at the door. I slowly moved toward it, each step heavier than the last, my breath shallow. My hand hovered over the doorknob, unsure of what to do. I could feel my pulse in my fingertips, thrumming with fear. I had to know what was behind that door. But what if it was the thing from before? What if it was worse? The house was too quiet now, too still. I could hear the tapping again, like nails against the wood, almost rhythmic. It wasn't frantic or hurried, it was patient, waiting for something. The hairs on my neck stood up as I twisted the knob and slowly pulled the door open. The hallway was dark, too dark, and the shadows seemed to stretch unnaturally long, reaching towards me. I could barely make out the outline of the stairs leading down, the dim glow from the kitchen light casting a faint glow down the hallway. Everything looked normal. Too normal. But there, just to the side, lying against the doorframe, was something I couldn't explain. A piece of broken glass. No, not just glass, a shard from a mirror. It was large, jagged, like something had been smashed against the door. And yet, I had no memory of breaking anything, no memory of it being there before. But there it was, a piece of reality shattered at my feet. I bent down slowly, feeling the pull of the dark, as if the shadows themselves were drawing me in. The sharp edges of the glass caught the light in strange ways, casting eerie reflections on the walls, shifting, changing with every move I made. A voice, soft but clear, echoed from deep within the house. It wasn't the whisper I had heard earlier, but something more distinct, more familiar. "Come find me." It was my voice. But not my voice. It was distorted, twisted, like a warped version of me, something that didn't belong. I jerked back, fear rising like bile in my throat. No, this was impossible. I was the only one here. I hadn't spoken. I couldn't have. The shard of mirror gleamed in the low light, reflecting back pieces of me, my face, my hand reaching for it, but it wasn't my eyes I saw in the reflection. The eyes in the shard were different, darker, colder. And they blinked. I staggered backward, dropping the shard in shock. My legs were shaky, threatening to give way beneath me. The reflection remained in the broken glass, frozen, staring back at me from the floor. I wanted to scream, but no sound escaped me. I couldn't tear my gaze away. The reflection of my face was distorted, no longer human, the eyes too wide, the mouth stretched into something resembling a grin, but one that didn't belong. That's when I realized the truth. The reflection wasn't me. It was the thing that had been watching me, the thing that had been in my room, the thing I barely escaped. It had been using me all along, feeding off my fear, twisting my reality. It was inside me now, and I could feel it. It wasn't just the house that had changed. It was me. I ran. Down the hallway, through the living room, past the windows that no longer seemed to let in the light. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know how to escape this. My breath came in ragged gasps, but no matter how fast I ran, the dark seemed to stretch around me, swallowing me whole. And then I heard it again, the tapping, faster now, closing in behind me. It was too close. I spun around, expecting to see something. But the hallway was empty. There was nothing there. Yet the tapping kept coming. Closer. And closer. I looked up, and for the first time, I saw the shadow stretching across the walls, taking shape, forming into something taller, darker. A figure. Not human. Something else. The giggle came again, but this time it wasn't a sound. It was inside my head, mocking me. You can't escape. I turned and ran, but the walls seemed to close in, pushing me toward the figure. I was trapped. The walls weren't just closing in anymore, they were pressing down on me, suffocating me. Each breath felt heavier, like I was drowning in the air itself. The tapping had stopped, but the silence was worse. The shadows around me stretched like fingers, curling and twisting, reaching for me, pulling me deeper into something I couldn't see. My heart pounded in my chest, but the sound felt muffled, as if the world around me was becoming thick, like I was underwater. I looked up, but the ceiling seemed to have disappeared, leaving only endless darkness above. The floor beneath me was uneven, jagged, like it had splintered, forcing me to take cautious steps. I had to escape. I had to get out of this nightmare. I turned, hoping to find the front door the way I had come in, but the hallway was no longer familiar. It was long, too long, like it had stretched out in the blink of an eye. My mind spun as I tried to make sense of the impossible geometry of the house. The walls were no longer straight, they bent and curved like they were alive, like they were warping with every second that passed. And then I saw it again. The figure. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It had substance. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed to go on forever. Its form was just a silhouette, featureless, formless, but there was a presence to it, something that made my stomach twist with fear. The same presence I had felt in my room, the one that had been watching me, waiting. It took a step forward, and the floor groaned under its weight, the sound like thunder in the silence. My legs refused to move. I couldn't run. I couldn't breathe. I tried to speak, to yell, but the words caught in my throat, suffocated by the weight of the air around me. My throat burned as if something was pressing against it from the inside. It was hard to focus, hard to think, as the thing slowly advanced. But then, in the periphery of my vision, I saw something, movement, a flicker of light. I snapped my head to the side, desperate for something familiar, anything that wasn't this. It was the door. The door to the outside. The light from the porch had just started to flicker on, casting long shadows across the yard. It was so close. So close. I staggered toward it, my feet unsteady as I dragged my body forward. Each step felt like I was walking through thick mud. The shadows clung to me, pulling me back, whispering in my ear, urging me to stop. But I couldn't stop. Not now. The figure was closer now, and I could hear its breath, slow and deliberate, as if it was savoring every moment. It was only a few feet behind me. I could feel the air grow colder, sharper, the temperature dropping with each step it took. I dared not look back. I could hear its footfalls behind me, hollow and echoing, like it was following me from a great distance. I was almost there. The door was so close now. I could taste the fresh air, feel the world beyond, just within reach. My hand stretched toward the doorknob, my fingers almost grazing it when I heard a voice, low, gravelly, like a whisper from the depths of a nightmare. "You're not getting away that easily." I froze, my heart stopping in my chest. I couldn't breathe. I felt something cold press against my neck, a sharp, biting chill that spread through my skin. It wasn't physical, but it was there, suffocating me, crawling under my skin. The world around me seemed to collapse. The door, my escape, disappeared, as if it had never been there. The hallway stretched out again, impossibly long. The shadows were everywhere now, swallowing everything, leaving no escape. I spun around, finally meeting the thing's gaze. Its eyes. No, it didn't have eyes. Not anymore. The blackness of its face was infinite, like the absence of light itself, a hole that consumed everything. But I could still feel it. It was there, in my mind, like a presence, a pressure, pushing against my skull. It didn't need to speak. I could hear it, feel it, deep in my bones. It was alive. It was waiting, watching. My legs shook beneath me, threatening to collapse. I needed to do something. I couldn't let it take me. I couldn't let it win. I looked around, frantic, but all I saw were the endless, twisted shadows. My mind was spinning, and I felt like I was losing control, like the walls were pressing on my thoughts, squeezing them, warping them into something unrecognizable. And then, I saw it. A flash of light. A flicker. The mirror shard, the one I had dropped earlier, lay on the ground, reflecting the distorted shadows. The broken glass gleamed with the faintest light, casting fractured reflections across the walls. The thing was still there, still moving closer, but I didn't care anymore. I couldn't think, couldn't rationalize. I had to act. My hand shot out, grabbing the shard. I didn't know why. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was desperation. But I lifted the shard, holding it in front of me like a weapon. The moment the broken glass touched my skin, I felt a rush of cold, a sharp, biting cold that shot through me like ice flowing through my veins. I could feel the darkness pressing in on me, but now, with the shard in my hand, I felt something shift. The shadows seemed to recoil from the light, from the glass, as if it was burning them, forcing them back. It wasn't enough. Not yet. I had to. The thing moved again, faster this time, its twisted, formless shape closing in on me. The glass shard trembled in my hand as I tried to push it forward, to drive it into whatever it was that was trying to take me. And then, in that moment, everything went dark. The last thing I heard was the voice. It wasn't a whisper. It was clear, piercing. You should have never come back. And then, nothing. The world was still dark when I opened my eyes again. But it wasn't just the darkness outside, it was the suffocating kind, the kind that you feel in your lungs, in your chest. It pressed against me like a heavy weight, making it hard to move, hard to breathe. My head was spinning, and every inch of my body felt as if it had been crushed under something cold, something unrelenting. For a moment, I thought I was dreaming. I had to be. There was no way any of this could be real. It felt too strange, too unreal, like I was trapped inside some twisted version of reality that I couldn't escape. I slowly pushed myself up, my hands shaky as they touched the cold floor beneath me. It was rough, uneven, the same floor I'd been standing on earlier, at least, I thought it was. The walls around me were no longer familiar, the familiar creaks and sounds of my house gone, replaced by the eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. I could barely see, but the air felt thick, dense, like it had weight. Every breath felt labored, like the very act of inhaling was a struggle. I reached out to steady myself, my fingers brushing against something soft, something wrong. My heart skipped a beat, my breath catching in my throat as my hand brushed against a warm surface. It wasn't wood. It wasn't fabric. It was skin. I jerked my hand away, eyes wide, pulse pounding in my ears. There was something, no, someone, right next to me. I couldn't see clearly yet, but I could feel its presence. I could feel the heat of its body, and the air around it seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. It was too still. Too quiet. I blinked, trying to clear the fog from my mind. My fingers trembled as they reached for the wall, pushing myself up to my knees. I could barely hear my own heartbeat, but there was something else. A low, guttural sound, like something breathing just beyond my ear, just out of sight. I had to get up. I had to move. I couldn't stay here. Slowly, I got to my feet, my legs unsteady, like they were made of stone. Every movement felt like a struggle. But I pushed forward. I had to get out. I had to escape. The darkness felt thicker now, like it had substance. It wasn't just the absence of light, it was as if the darkness itself had weight, had form, as if it were alive, creeping around me, swallowing everything in its path. The shadows on the walls were deeper now, darker. They moved, twisted, bit like living things, crawling along the floor, reaching up toward me. I stumbled forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps, trying to make sense of the space around me. I couldn't tell where I was. The walls weren't just walls anymore. They had changed, shifted. The familiar layout of my house was gone, replaced by something else, something wrong. The air was different, too. Heavier. The temperature had dropped even further, the chill creeping into my bones, seeping into my skin. And then, I saw it again. The figure. It was a silhouette at first, just a dark shape against the shadows, but this time, it wasn't moving. It was standing still, watching me. I couldn't make out its features, but I knew it was there. I could feel it, the same oppressive presence that had haunted me before. It was watching me. I took a step back, but the darkness seemed to close in around me, making it impossible to move. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. The figure shifted slightly, and that's when I saw the eyes. Not human eyes. Not anything that could be described as eyes at all. They were black, deep, endless pits that seemed to absorb everything around them. But they were looking at me. They were aware of me. I froze. My heart hammered in my chest. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. The eyes were pulling me in, drowning me in that cold, empty gaze. And then I heard it. A voice, soft but unmistakable, coming from nowhere and everywhere all at once. It was low, almost a whisper, but it resonated through my very bones. Why did you come back? The words sent a chill through me. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I could barely think straight. The figure took a step toward me, and the shadows seemed to shift with it, crawling along the floor and the walls, wrapping themselves around my legs, my arms, like tendrils of darkness trying to pull me under. It was all too much. The air was too thick. The pressure was too strong. I was suffocating. I could feel the cold seeping into my skin, into my very soul. My body trembled, shaking violently, but I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. The shadows were everywhere now, closing in, choking me. The voice came again, this time closer, louder. It wasn't just speaking to me. It was speaking through me. Did you really think you could run? You can't hide. You never could. The words rang in my head, echoing over and over again, and the pressure around me grew stronger. I felt like I was being crushed, slowly, relentlessly. My vision started to blur, my knees buckling under the weight of the darkness. But then, something shifted. A faint light, a spark in the distance. It was small, but it was there. It cut through the darkness, a beacon, a way out. I stumbled toward it, my feet dragging, my body heavy, but I kept moving. The figure was still behind me, but I didn't care anymore. I didn't know how long I could keep moving, how long I could keep breathing, but I had to try. The light grew brighter, and for a moment, I thought I saw the outline of the door again, the door I had been searching for. But it was different now. The edges were sharp, the frame glowing with a faint light, as if it had been waiting for me. I reached for it, my hand shaking, my breath ragged, and suddenly, the figure was right behind me. I could feel its presence, cold, dark, suffocating. I heard its breath, ragged, like it was too close to me now. "You won't escape," it whispered in my ear. "You're already mine." I grabbed the handle of the door, yanked it open with every ounce of strength I had left, and the world went dark again. Have you ever felt someone watching you, even when you're alone? That tingling sensation on the back of your neck, the unease in your gut? I didn't believe in such things, not until this morning. It was a regular routine, the kind I'd done 1,000 times before. The quiet hum of the house, the soft shuffle of my slippers across the wooden floor, and the coldness of the bathroom tiles beneath my bare feet. I never expected that morning would change everything. The mirror was fogged up, mist from the hot water filling the bathroom as I splashed my face. I rubbed the towel across my eyes, trying to clear away the sleep. When I opened them, that's when I saw it, something in the reflection. Not just the usual, familiar image of myself standing there, eyes still slightly bloodshot from waking. No. It was someone else. Someone behind me. I froze. My heart skipped a beat. I didn't dare move. I didn't even blink. The figure in the mirror, tall, dressed in dark clothes, stood so close I could almost feel their breath on my neck. But when I turned around, there was nothing. Just the empty bathroom, the soft humming of the water running, the low creak of the house settling. I blinked rapidly, my hand instinctively reaching out to touch my face, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. A trick of the light, maybe? My eyes were tired, or perhaps my mind was still caught between dreams and reality. I glanced back at the mirror. There was no one there. But I knew what I'd seen. I didn't want to believe it. It couldn't be real. It was just a reflection, nothing more. But then, as I stared into the glass, something made me shudder, a subtle movement, almost imperceptible. The figure, still there, now a little closer, just a few inches away. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't move. Didn't speak. I didn't even want to blink. I looked away from the mirror, back at the bathroom. It was the same as it had always been, except it didn't feel the same. The walls seemed a bit darker, the air a little heavier, like the light in the room had dimmed without me noticing. I turned back to face the mirror again, the reflection still standing there. But this time, the figure wasn't just standing. It was moving. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, its head tilted in my direction, as if it were studying me, waiting for me to react. I reached for the towel, my hand shaking, drying my face, trying to regain control of my senses. The figure didn't move away. It wasn't a figment of my imagination, it was real. I could feel it. But why? Why had it appeared? What did it want from me? I stood there, paralyzed, as the room seemed to get colder, darker. Every muscle in my body screamed for me to leave, but I couldn't. Something held me in place, something far stronger than my will to escape. The figure's eyes, if they could even be called eyes, began to shine faintly. At first, it was just a glint, like a distant reflection of light. But then, it deepened. The dark eyes seemed to pull in all the light, swallowing it. And just like that, I saw it clearly for the first time. The figure had no face, just a blank, smooth surface where a face should have been. I stepped back, my feet dragging against the cold floor as my body trembled. The silence was overwhelming. The sound of my pulse in my ears was deafening. I had to get out. I had to leave. But something inside me, some force I couldn't explain, made me keep looking at the mirror. I wanted to turn away. I wanted to forget what I had seen. But when I did, the reflection in the mirror wasn't mine anymore. It was someone else's. The figure had stepped closer, its movements now sharper, more deliberate. I could see it in the way its arms shifted, the way its head turned, as though it were alive, waiting for me to acknowledge it. This wasn't normal. What was happening? I turned again. Nothing. Just the bathroom. But my breath was ragged now, the air thick in my chest. I had to get out. I wasn't imagining this. I couldn't be. But I had to look. I couldn't stop myself. I glanced at the mirror again, and my heart nearly stopped. It was right there. It was in front of me. The figure. Its face, smooth and featureless, now had a shadow, one that didn't match the light in the room. It was leaning in, coming closer to the surface of the glass, closer to me. I stepped back, the hairs on my neck standing on end, but I couldn't look away. The figure's eyes, those empty, soulless pits, were fixed on me, and I realized, with a sinking feeling, that I had no idea if it was still a reflection anymore. It didn't matter that I wasn't facing it. It was there, right behind me, and for the first time, I truly felt that cold, unnatural presence, as if something was waiting in the dark just for me. But it wasn't just waiting. It was watching. It was waiting for the right moment to act. I could feel it in my bones. The reflection wasn't just a mirror. It was something else. The room felt colder now. I could almost hear the distant sound of my own heartbeat loud in my ears. My breath, shallow and quick, left a thin mist in the air as if the temperature had dropped several degrees in the blink of an eye. The mirror, my reflection, was still there, but the figure was no longer just a distant shadow. It had advanced, its smooth, featureless face inches from the glass, as if pressing itself against the invisible barrier that separated our worlds. I didn't dare to move. The silence was oppressive, suffocating. I tried to swallow, but my throat felt tight, as if my body was instinctively resisting the air around me. The figure's presence seemed to pull at the very atmosphere, distorting the space between us. The familiar bathroom, the one I'd used every morning for years, no longer felt like mine. It felt alien, as though the walls had shifted imperceptibly and the floors beneath my feet weren't solid anymore. Everything was off, just enough to make me doubt my senses. I wanted to scream. I wanted to run. But the figure's eyes, or what I assumed were eyes, held me there, immobilized. It wasn't just the lack of features. It wasn't just the absence of humanity. It was something deeper, something more primal, an unnatural, unsettling stillness that gnawed at my sanity. It was as if it were waiting for something, for me, maybe. I forced my gaze away from the mirror, but my eyes refused to focus on anything else. The bathroom's walls seemed to close in, each creak of the old wooden beams above me sounding like an explosion in the quiet. The air around me thickened, and I could feel the temperature continue to drop. A chill ran through my spine as my eyes involuntarily darted back toward the glass. It was closer now, closer than it had ever been. I wasn't imagining this. I could see the faint, almost imperceptible outline of what could have been its hands pressed flat against the surface of the mirror as though trying to break through. The glass rippled slightly, like water disturbed by a stone. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was an invitation, a connection to something beyond the confines of the mirror. I could almost hear it breathing, or at least, I thought I could. Was it my imagination? Or was it the figure, somehow, trying to reach out? The idea made me sick to my stomach. I stumbled back, bumping into the sink. The sound of porcelain scraping against my skin snapped me back to reality. I didn't know what was real anymore. It was just a mirror. Just a reflection. That's what I kept telling myself. That's what my mind was desperately trying to convince me. But the more I repeated it, the less I believed it. The mirror had never felt like this before. Never. It had always been just a tool, something to check my appearance, to brush my hair, to splash cold water on my face when I was tired. But now it felt like a doorway, a threshold to something I couldn't comprehend. I turned, pacing back and forth in the bathroom, trying to shake the growing sense of dread that clung to my skin. My thoughts were scattered, chaotic. What if I wasn't the only one in here anymore? What if something from the other side of the mirror had crossed into my world? Could that be possible? The air seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. The faint, rhythmic ticking of a clock from down the hall became deafening in the silence. I could feel the seconds dragging on, each one heavier than the last. I glanced over at the door, but something inside me told me not to leave. It wasn't safe. Not yet. I had to face it. Slowly, I turned toward the mirror again, my heart pounding in my chest. For a split second, I hesitated, afraid of what I might see. But curiosity, or maybe fear, pushed me forward. I took a step toward the mirror. One step, and then another. I felt the pull again, like the reflection was calling me, drawing me closer. I reached out, my fingertips brushing the cool surface. My touch left a faint streak on the glass, but it didn't feel like glass. It felt soft, like skin. My breath caught in my throat. I pulled my hand back quickly, but it was too late. The mirror didn't reflect my movement. It mirrored me, yes, but it was more than that. The figure, its body now almost fully visible, pressing forward, was mimicking my every move, like it was attached to me, like it was an extension of myself. It grinned. Not a smile, but a slow, creeping twist of its featureless face. The smooth surface contorted as though it had suddenly acquired the ability to express emotion, to mock me. I recoiled, stumbling backward, knocking into the wall. My pulse hammered in my chest. This wasn't real. This couldn't be real. But it was. I was shaking, trembling so violently I could barely stand. My thoughts raced, but they were incoherent, jumbled. There had to be an explanation. There had to be a way out. I couldn't just stand here, trapped in my own reflection. I glanced once more at the mirror. The figure was no longer mirroring me. It was free. It was looking at me, watching me. Its arms were outstretched toward the glass, but instead of pushing against the surface, it was pulling as though trying to escape. And then it spoke. Not with words, but with a sound that was almost like a hiss, a whisper too soft to hear but loud enough to shake my soul. I didn't understand it. I didn't want to. I had to leave. I had to run. But as I turned to go, I felt something brush against my neck. Something cold. Something other. I spun around, but the mirror was empty. Nothing was there. For a moment, I thought I might be losing my mind. But then, I saw it, a faint outline, like a shadow, lingering in the reflection. Only it wasn't me. It was something else. And it was still watching. I couldn't breathe. The air was too thick, too heavy. The temperature had dropped even more, to the point where I could see my breath in front of me, swirling in pale clouds. I had to get out. But where was I supposed to go? The door seemed so far away now, almost like it was an impossible distance to cross. I took a step back, my legs shaky, almost as if the floor beneath me wasn't solid. It felt wrong. Every movement felt sluggish, like the room itself was pushing against me, urging me to stay, to remain in this awful, suffocating space. The mirror, no, the reflection, was still there, haunting me, lingering in the glass. It was no longer just an image. It was alive, breathing, aware. I glanced at the door again. The door, the one that was supposed to lead me out. But the closer I looked, the more something felt off. I could see the familiar wooden frame, the worn-out doorknob that I had turned countless times before. Yet, now it seemed foreign. The edges of the door seemed to blur, as though they were fading into the walls. Or maybe the walls were closing in around it. I shook my head, trying to push the thought away. I needed to focus. My breath was coming faster now, panic setting in. What if I wasn't supposed to leave? What if the reflection had already taken me somewhere else? Was I still in the same place? Was I still in my bathroom, or was I trapped in some twisted version of reality? I took another step backward, this time toward the mirror. No. I couldn't just stand here, frozen. I had to keep moving. But where? There was nowhere to go. I looked into the mirror again, my hand raised slightly in front of me as if to protect myself. The figure was closer now, but it wasn't just standing still anymore. Its movements were fluid, unnatural, like it was stretching across the glass. It wasn't just mimicking me anymore. It was becoming me. I felt my stomach churn at the thought, but I couldn't tear my gaze away. I watched, horrified, as the figure's shape morphed. Its body seemed to bend, twist, like it was being shaped by something invisible, something far more sinister than I could comprehend. Its arms were no longer still, and it was moving toward the edge of the glass, its fingers outstretched as if they were trying to reach through. To me, a sudden cold swept over me, like an icy gust that tore through the room. My skin prickled, goosebumps rising in waves across my arms. I shivered, the chill making my entire body tense. The reflection, it was now right behind me. I could feel it. I could feel its presence, pressing against my back, just inches away. I spun around, heart hammering in my chest. There was nothing there. Just the cold bathroom, the dim light above flickering, and the faint sound of water dripping from the faucet. But it wasn't enough to comfort me. Because I knew it was still there. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to get away from the mirror, away from that thing. I rushed toward the door, my pulse racing, my head spinning. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the knob, my fingers slipping from the cold metal as I tried to twist it open. It wouldn't move. No matter how hard I turned the knob, the door wouldn't budge. It was as if the door had become a part of the walls, locked in place, unyielding. Panic surged in my chest. I slammed my shoulder into the door again and again, but it didn't give. The walls seemed to close in even tighter, as though they were alive and pressing in on me. I screamed, desperate. But my voice was swallowed by the thick, suffocating silence. Then, a voice. It wasn't my voice. It wasn't the figure's voice either. It was a whisper. A soft, slithering sound coming from the reflection. "You can't leave," it said, the words jagged, like broken glass, slicing through the stillness. "You belong here." I froze, my body trembling. The voice echoed in my mind, reverberating deep in my bones. The words were clear, but they didn't make sense. I didn't understand. I wasn't supposed to be here. I was supposed to be in my own world, in my own bathroom. But somehow, I felt like the reflection was pulling me in, drawing me in. I turned back toward the mirror, half expecting the figure to be right there, in the glass. But it wasn't. It was closer. I didn't need to look at the reflection to know it was standing behind me. I could feel it. The air shifted, the temperature dropping even further. My skin crawled as something cold brushed against the back of my neck. I didn't dare to turn around. I couldn't. It was there. And it wasn't going to let me go. I backed away from the mirror slowly, still trying to open the door, still trying to escape. But the closer I got to the door, the more I could feel it. Something was wrong. The walls were closing in on me. The mirror's reflection seemed to stretch further, distorting the space around me. I turned again, looking at the mirror one last time. The reflection was alive now, writhing and twisting like it had taken on a life of its own, its dark outline shifting, merging with the room itself. I could see my own face, but there was something off about it. My eyes, wide with fear, seemed to stare back at me from the mirror, but not in the same way. It was as if my reflection didn't belong to me anymore. I was being replaced. "You'll stay with me," it whispered, its voice like a rustling of leaves, faint and chilling. "You'll be part of me." I reached for the door again, my hands slick with sweat, and I finally managed to force it open. But as I stepped out into the hallway, I heard the voice again, this time louder, clearer. "You can't escape. You never will." I turned to look over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. The hallway was empty. But the feeling of something following me, something close, something watching me, remained. I couldn't shake the feeling. No matter how far I walked, no matter how many rooms I passed, something was following me. A presence. Not physical, but close enough that I could feel it, hear it, like a shadow slipping just out of view. Every step was heavier than the last, like I was dragging something invisible behind me. I tried to push the feeling away. "It's in my head," I told myself. "It's just my nerves, the panic." But the air was colder now, even in the hallway. It pressed against me, suffocating me. Every time I breathed, it felt like I was drawing in the same stale, lifeless air, filling my lungs with something that didn't belong there. I reached the stairs. The house seemed bigger than I remembered. I could feel the weight of the silence, the way it pressed down on me like 1,000 eyes were watching from the dark corners of the rooms. The stairs creaked beneath me as I took each step, louder than they should have been. Though it felt unstable, like it was groaning under the weight of some unseen force. I reached the landing, and for the first time, I dared to look back. The hallway behind me was dark, but I could have sworn there was something in the shadows, something that wasn't quite right. I could make out the outline of a figure, just standing there. Not moving. Just waiting. My heart skipped. I spun around quickly, forcing myself to face forward. The floor was pulling at my feet, like I was being dragged back toward the reflection. I gripped the railing with both hands, trying to steady myself. My thoughts were racing. I couldn't let it win. I couldn't let it pull me back into that thing. Whatever it was. I ran down the stairs, faster than I ever thought I could move. The wooden steps blurred beneath me, and the walls seemed to close in as I descended. I had to get out. But where? The house felt like it was growing, stretching. It had never been this big. It felt endless now, each hallway twisting into another, each room leading into another dimension of its own. I stopped when I reached the bottom floor. The door was ahead of me. The exit. But it was different. The same door. The same old, creaky thing, but it was now encased in shadows. Like the darkness was spilling from the cracks, seeping into the room. I stepped toward it, my body trembling, each step louder in the silent house than it should have been. I reached for the doorknob, my hand shaking as I grasped it. It didn't turn. I twisted it again, harder this time. Nothing. The door was locked. It was as though the house had sealed itself shut. I turned away from the door, my panic rising. I couldn't just stay here. I couldn't. There had to be a way out. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw it. The mirror. It was there, in the hallway to my right, where there hadn't been one before. It stood against the wall, its dark surface reflecting nothing but the darkness of the room. No light. No shadow. Just an endless void. I froze. It was the same mirror. The same reflection. No. I told myself. No. This is impossible. It's not real. But as if to prove me wrong, a shape slowly began to appear in the reflection. At first, it was just a distortion in the glass. Then, slowly, it solidified into the same figure I had seen earlier. It was darker this time, more defined, more menacing. Its features were sharp, almost skeletal, and its eyes were wide, black holes that sucked in the light around them. It wasn't just watching me anymore. It was waiting. I could feel it pulling me toward the glass. Every fiber of my being screamed to run, to get away, to get out of this house. But my body wouldn't move. It was as though my feet were glued to the floor, the air heavy with some kind of unnatural force that made it impossible to breathe or think. I could feel it again. That pressure on my back. The coldness. The reflection was moving closer. And then, in the blink of an eye, it stepped out of the mirror. I didn't have time to react. One moment it was just a reflection, and the next, its arm shot out from the glass, long, thin fingers wrapping around my wrist in a vice-like grip. A scream tore through me, but it was swallowed by the suffocating silence that followed. The reflection's face was inches from mine, its eyes gleaming with something far darker than any human could possess. The skin on its face was stretched tight, the color of ash, and its mouth was wide open, too wide, like it could swallow me whole. It pulled me closer, and for a second, I thought it was going to drag me into the glass, to pull me into the mirror itself. I tried to fight back, tried to wrench my arm free, but its grip was too strong. Its smile stretched even further, like it was tearing at the edges of its face. "You can't escape," it whispered, its voice like 1,000 nails scraping across glass. "You belong to me now." I reached out with my free hand, clawing at anything I could touch. My fingers brushed against the wall, and for a second, I thought I could pull myself away. I slammed my fist against the mirror, desperately trying to break it, to shatter the image that was holding me hostage. But instead of cracking, the mirror seemed to pulse, like it was alive. The reflection laughed, and that laugh echoed in my ears, a twisted sound that was both inside my head and in the room with me. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think. I didn't know where I was anymore. All I knew was that the reflection, it was in control. And there was nothing I could do to stop it. I don't know how long I was trapped in that moment. Time didn't exist in the suffocating blackness between breaths. The mirror's icy grip still held me tight, its reflection pulling at my very soul, and yet somehow, my own mind was still fighting to hold on to what little sanity I had left. With every ounce of strength I could muster, I pushed against the force that bound me to the mirror. My pulse was hammering in my ears, drowning out everything else. The reflection's grin grew wider, its mouth now stretching impossibly far, as if it could engulf my entire head. No. No. I can't die here. I can't. I won't. It was all I could think. I had to break free. I had to find a way to escape this nightmare. I felt the pressure on my wrist tighten. The reflection, that thing, it was pulling me closer, its fingers like claws, digging into my skin. My heart raced as I twisted and pulled my arm in every direction, desperately trying to break its hold. But it was futile. Then, for a split second, a flicker of movement behind the reflection caught my eye. My mind, clouded with fear and confusion, couldn't process it at first. But when I looked again, I saw it. A shadow. A dark shape standing just beyond the mirror. For a moment, I thought I was imagining it, just another trick of the mind, born from the terror that was taking hold of me. But it wasn't. There was something real, something that didn't belong, lurking in the space beyond the glass. The figure in the mirror seemed to notice too. Its eyes flicked to the side, and I saw it, fear, in its gaze, something unfamiliar. The reflection seemed to hesitate, its movements becoming jerky, as if it were trying to fight something that it couldn't control. The shadow moved forward, its outline shifting as if it were made of smoke. It was coming closer to the mirror. Closer to me. The reflection tried to pull away, but it couldn't. The shadow reached out, its hands long and skeletal, just inches away from the glass. And then it happened. With a violent crack, the mirror shattered. Shards of glass exploded outward, raining down around me, and for the first time, the grip on my wrist loosened. I fell backward, hitting the floor hard, breathless and gasping. The reflection, the thing that had held me captive, was gone. But the shadow was still there. I looked up in a daze, the pieces of glass scattered around me. My hands shook uncontrollably as I pushed myself to my feet, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The shadow lingered, its form now clearer, more defined, and yet still not quite real. It was like it was fading in and out of existence, flickering like a broken light bulb. I couldn't make out its face, but the coldness in the room intensified, and I could feel the weight of its presence pressing down on me. It didn't move. It just watched. I took a shaky step back, my head spinning. Was this real? Was it all some kind of hallucination? My body ached, and my mind screamed for clarity, for answers, but there were none. The house felt suffocating, the air thick with the weight of something ancient and unnatural. I wanted to run. I needed to get out of here. But my feet felt glued to the ground, as though the very house itself was holding me in place. The shadow took a step forward, its form slowly becoming more tangible, more threatening. It moved like liquid darkness, its shape undulating as though it were alive. My heart pounded in my chest. What was it? I forced my legs to move, backing away, but the floor beneath me felt like it was shifting, like the walls were closing in. I stumbled, tripping over something I couldn't see, but when I looked, nothing was there. Then, Just as suddenly as it had appeared, the shadow lunged at me. I didn't have time to scream. There was only darkness, cold, suffocating, all-consuming. The last thing I remember was the feeling of something cold and hard wrapping around my neck, tightening, choking the air from my lungs. I woke up on the floor. The first thing I noticed was the silence. It wasn't the same silence I had felt earlier, though. It wasn't the oppressive, suffocating kind. No, this was different. It felt empty. Like the house itself had gone quiet, holding its breath, waiting for something. I sat up slowly, my head pounding, as if someone had slammed it against the floor. My vision blurred, but I forced myself to stand. The air was still cold, but the weight, the presence of something watching me, had vanished. I looked around the room, my eyes darting nervously from corner to corner. There was no shadow. No reflection. Nothing. But as I turned, my gaze fell on the shards of the mirror that still littered the floor, glinting like 1,000 tiny eyes. I froze. And then I saw it. The reflection. It wasn't in the broken glass. It was standing in the corner of the room, facing me. A perfect human figure. It was me. Or at least, it looked like me. But I could see the difference now. The way it moved. The way its smile was too wide, too wrong. Its eyes glowed faintly in the dim light. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But it was there. And this time, it wasn't just a reflection. This time, it was a guest. It began with a question. One simple thought that crept into my mind when I awoke, and it stuck there like a splinter. Was this still a dream? The room looked the same. The familiar dim light filtering through the curtains, the same old wooden desk piled with clutter, the clock on the wall ticking away as though nothing had changed. But something was off. I couldn't put my finger on it, not at first. I looked around, rubbing my eyes, still groggy from sleep. I wasn't sure if I had just woken up from another dream or if this was real. My body felt heavy, like I was being held in place by invisible hands. The room smelled faintly of lavender, just like last night, yet I hadn't lit the candle. I blinked again. It felt like my brain was trying to piece together broken memories, memories that didn't quite align. The bed, the walls, the furniture, all of it was too familiar, but something about them seemed wrong. This isn't how I left it. I shook my head and tried to focus. There was nothing particularly strange about the room. The house was old, certainly, with its creaky floors and the smell of dust that clung to every corner. But I had lived here for years. I knew every inch of it. Or so I thought. The more I examined the room, the more I realized that certain things were out of place. A photograph on the wall that I had never seen before, tucked into the corner next to the dresser. I walked closer to inspect it. It was an old picture, black and white, with faded edges. In it, a woman I didn't recognize stood beside a man, both smiling awkwardly at the camera. I reached for it, but the instant my fingers touched the glass, I felt a chill run through my spine. What the hell is this? The image didn't make sense. I had no memory of ever seeing it, yet it was right there, hanging as though it belonged. My hands trembled as I pulled it off the wall. The frame was cold to the touch, and the glass almost seemed to hum with some strange energy. And then, I saw something else, something even more unsettling. On the back of the photograph, in what looked like smudged pencil, was a name. Clara. The name sent a ripple of confusion through my thoughts. I had no idea who Clara was. Yet, there it was, written as though it had always been there, as though I had always known her. I turned the photograph over in my hands, but just as I was about to examine the back more closely, I heard it. A noise. Faint, but unmistakable. A soft shuffling sound, as if someone was moving around just outside my bedroom door. My heart skipped a beat. I stood still, holding my breath, straining to listen. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had started. For a few seconds, there was nothing but the gentle hum of the house, the soft creak of the floorboards, the ticking of the clock. And then it came again. This time, closer. I moved toward the door, my pulse quickening. This isn't right. This can't be real. I glanced over my shoulder. The room looked the same, but now I could feel something lurking in the air. A presence. Something waiting. I grabbed the doorknob and twisted it, but the door wouldn't open. It was locked from the outside. I yanked at it in frustration, the metal screeching beneath my fingers. Why is it locked? I stepped back, the coldness creeping under my skin. The room felt suffocating, as though the walls were closing in. The temperature had dropped. My breath came out in invisible puffs, clouding the air before me. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer now, as though someone was walking right outside. My heart hammered in my chest. And then it stopped. Silence. I took a step back, heart racing. The tension in the air was unbearable, and the weight of it pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. I need to get out of here. I turned and tried to push the window open, but it was stuck. The familiar, ordinary things in this room were suddenly alien. Nothing made sense. Nothing was how it should be. And then I saw it. The book on the floor. It was an old leather-bound book, one I didn't recognize. But as I reached down to pick it up, a flood of images washed over me, flashes of faces, places, and moments that didn't belong in my life. It was the same book. The one I dreamed about. The one that had been in the dream, the one that had appeared in my hands when I tried to open the door. But how could that be? I opened the book slowly, the pages turning with a rustling sound that sent a shiver down my spine. The words were written in a language I didn't understand, but I could feel the weight of their meaning pressing against me like a physical force. I slammed the book shut. My mind raced. What is going on? I had never seen the book before, yet there it was, just like in my dream. And the strangest part? The cover was smooth and new, no sign of age, no sign of wear. And then I realized the worst part. I didn't even remember falling asleep. The question I had woken up with, the one that had lingered in my mind, came back to me again, sharper now. Was this still a dream? But there was no answer. Not yet. I sat there for what felt like hours, the book clenched tightly in my hands. The air around me felt heavy, suffocating, like it was pressing in from all sides. I could barely breathe. My thoughts were racing, colliding with each other, a tangled mess of confusion and fear. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest as I tried to make sense of what was happening. Is this real? I asked myself again, though the question no longer felt as simple as before. Everything had started to blur together, dream and reality, waking and sleeping. What was real anymore? Was anything? The shuffling noise from outside my door was still there, faint, but persistent. It seemed to follow a rhythm, like someone pacing back and forth, waiting. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. a cold sweat beginning to form on my skin. I couldn't take it any longer. I had to know what was going on. I shoved the book into my backpack, barely glancing at it before I stood up and moved toward the door again. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob, but this time something felt different. The door felt lighter, like it had been unlocked without me noticing. I hesitated for a moment, unsure of what I might find on the other side. But then I pushed the door open, stepping into the hallway. It was empty, just like I had expected, but the air felt wrong, damp, thick, almost oppressive. I listened for the sound of footsteps, but there was nothing now. Just the sound of my own breathing, loud and uneven. Something was definitely off. I turned to look down the hallway. It was the same as always, bare, with the dim light flickering overhead, casting long shadows on the walls. But as I moved toward the staircase, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. There, at the bottom of the stairs, was the same photograph from my room, but one I hadn't remembered seeing before. The frame was cracked, the glass smudged with fingerprints. I could barely make out the faces of the people in the photo, but I didn't need to look closely to feel the dread settle in my chest. This was the same photo. The same one that had been on my wall. But how? I swallowed hard, my throat dry as I took a step back. What's happening? My mind was a storm of questions, each one more disturbing than the last. I reached out to touch the photograph, and as my fingers brushed against the cracked glass, a sharp noise rang out from above. The sound of footsteps. Heavy, deliberate steps. Slowly descending the stairs toward me. I froze. Who could be in my house? Who was upstairs? I looked up, my heart racing, but the staircase was empty. There was no one there. The steps, however, continued to come closer. Thud. 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 I backed away from the stairs, panic clawing at my chest. The footsteps grew louder, closer, but still no one appeared. The air in the hallway thickened, like the world itself was holding its breath. I needed to get out of here. My body moved on its own, instinctively heading toward the front door. But when I reached it, I found it locked, just like my bedroom door had been. I tried the handle again, more urgently this time, but it wouldn't budge. The feeling of being trapped started to settle over me like a suffocating weight. I pounded my fist against the door, the wood rattling in its frame. And then, I heard it again. The sound of the footsteps, now right behind me. I spun around. Nothing. The hallway was empty. There was no one there. No one that I could see, anyway. But the footsteps continued, growing louder, closer, as though something, or someone, was right beside me, breathing down my neck. I ran. I bolted back into the living room, slamming the door behind me and throwing myself into a chair. My hands were shaking, my breath coming in sharp gasps. I couldn't think. Couldn't focus. My brain was scrambling, trying to make sense of everything. I looked around the room. It was the same as it had been when I first woke up, but now it felt like a completely different place, like I was seeing it through someone else's eyes. Nothing felt real. The walls seemed to close in on me, the room shrinking, the air getting thinner. And then it hit me. The smell. That faint scent of lavender. It was stronger now, almost overwhelming, clinging to the air, to the walls, to the very fabric of the house. But I hadn't lit the candle. I hadn't even thought about it. So where was the smell coming from? I got up and moved toward the source, the scent growing more intense as I approached the small table by the window. There, sitting innocently in the middle of the table, was the same lavender-scented candle, one that I didn't recognize. I could feel my pulse quicken, my hands trembling as I picked it up, examining the unfamiliar label. Clara. I dropped the candle, my breath catching in my throat. The name was written in a delicate, cursive script, just like the name on the back of the photograph. Clara. My mind was racing. There had to be a connection. There had to be some explanation for all this, but the more I thought about it, the less I understood. I felt dizzy, my vision blurring at the edges. The world around me felt like it was slipping away, like I was falling deeper into a dream, unable to wake up. The walls seemed to pulse with a low hum, the air vibrating with something unseen. And then, in the corner of the room, I saw it. A shadow. It wasn't just a shadow, it was moving. Slowly, shifting, taking form. I didn't know what it was, but I knew one thing for certain. It was coming for me. The shadow moved closer, its form growing clearer, more defined, as if it were solidifying from the air itself. My heart thudded in my chest, each beat a drum of panic. I could feel it, a presence, something dark and menacing that didn't belong here. It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was a figure. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. The figure was tall, with indistinct features, as though it were wearing a cloak of darkness. Its presence filled the room, stretching across the walls, casting a thick, suffocating shadow that seemed to swallow up everything it touched. What the hell is that? The thought barely formed in my mind before I saw it move again. Slowly, deliberately, it inched closer. It didn't make a sound, no footsteps, no rustling of fabric. Just the quiet sound of the air being displaced, as if something unseen was disturbing it. I took a shaky step back, the cold sweat on my skin now turning into an icy chill. My legs trembled beneath me, but I couldn't look away. I couldn't make myself turn and run. It was like my body refused to move, trapped by some unseen force. The shadow reached the center of the room and stopped. The air felt thick around me, like I was underwater, struggling to get enough air. My thoughts were a jumble, my mind scrambling to understand what was happening. Was this real? Or was I still dreaming? A voice, low, barely a whisper, breathed across the room. It wasn't a sound. It was a sensation, like the words were inside my head, rattling my thoughts. Clara. The name echoed, bouncing off the walls, vibrating through my bones. My stomach churned. That same name from the photograph. The candle. But who was Clara? The figure's form wavered for a moment, like smoke curling in the air. It seemed to be staring at me, though I couldn't see its eyes. Or maybe it didn't need eyes. The thought made my skin crawl. I stumbled backward, my feet finally moving, but not quickly enough. The figure stepped forward, and suddenly the room felt smaller. The walls were closing in, the air thick and stifling. I had to get out of here. But where was the door? I spun around, my eyes scanning the room. The door to the hallway was gone. The window, which had once been wide open, was now shut tight. The room felt as if it were shifting, changing shape, warping into something else, something unrecognizable. This isn't real. This can't be real. The shadow moved again, gliding across the floor with an unnatural smoothness. It was almost like it was floating, drifting silently toward me. I could feel its weight, its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. I wanted to scream, to run, but no sound came out. My mouth was dry, my throat tight. Then, something worse happened. The figure, Clara, or whatever it was, reached out. A long, skeletal hand emerged from the darkness, fingers long and spindly, stretching toward me. The hand seemed to glide through the air, like it wasn't bound by the rules of physics. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up as the cold, unnatural air rushed toward me. The figure's hand was inches away now, just about to touch me. Bang! The sound shattered the air. A loud, thunderous bang, like something had exploded outside. The walls trembled, the floor shook beneath my feet, and the figure froze. For a split second, the world seemed to go still. The pressure in the room lifted, just enough to let me breathe, to give me a moment of clarity. I didn't think. I didn't question. I just ran. I darted past the shadow, my body screaming in pain as I forced myself to move faster than I thought possible. The door, there was a door now, at the far end of the room. I could see it, just barely, in the dim light. I didn't care if it was real or not. I needed to escape. I flung the door open, stumbling out into the dark hallway. The sound of the footsteps, those footsteps that had followed me from the start, were back, closer now, relentless, drawing nearer with each passing second. I didn't dare look behind me. I ran. Down the hallway, around the corner, into the living room. But the familiar space was no longer familiar. The walls were warped, the furniture twisted and distorted. It was like I had entered another world, one that mirrored my own but was off-kilter, wrong. The smell of lavender was overpowering now, suffocating. It filled my nose, my lungs, making it hard to breathe. It was everywhere, clinging to everything, saturating the air. The floor beneath my feet was slick, as if something had spilled across it. I could feel it on my skin, cold and wet, but when I looked down, there was nothing there. Nothing except for the faint outline of a figure standing in the corner. I froze. It was Clara, or whatever this was. The figure stood motionless, but I could feel its presence pressing in on me, like it was watching me, waiting for me to make the next move. "You shouldn't have come back," a voice whispered from the darkness. I turned to run, but my legs felt heavy, as though they were being dragged back, as though something was holding me down. Panic surged through me, and I forced my legs to move. But the door, there was no door anymore. The hallway had disappeared. The walls were closing in, the ceiling low and oppressive. The figure in the corner was moving now, coming closer, its steps silent and fluid, like it wasn't even touching the ground. I was trapped. My heart pounded in my chest, my thoughts spiraling out of control. Was I still dreaming? Or had I crossed some line, some point of no return, where reality and nightmare blurred together? The world tilted, the walls bending in unnatural ways. And then, just as the figure reached me, everything went black. I woke up with a gasp, my breath coming in shallow, panic bursts. My heart was racing, my chest tight as if someone had been sitting on it, pressing all the air out of my lungs. My eyes flew open, the room spinning, disorienting. The dim light filtering through the curtains didn't comfort me, it made everything feel even stranger. The air in the room was still thick with that same oppressive heaviness. I'm awake. I have to be awake. But the thoughts felt wrong. They were more like a mantra I had to repeat to myself to stay grounded. My head throbbed. The dream, or whatever that had been, still clung to me. The line between what had happened in my sleep and what was happening now was thin, threadbare. I rubbed my eyes, blinking, trying to focus. The room seemed too real, too solid, but there was something off. The lavender smell was still there, faint but noticeable, lingering in the corners of the room like it had somehow seeped into the walls. But it didn't make sense. I didn't have any lavender candles, didn't even like the smell. It wasn't something I used, not in this house. My gaze flickered to the dresser by the wall. I hadn't noticed it before, but now there it was, a small, delicate silver necklace. It was strange. I didn't own a necklace like that. It wasn't mine. I reached out for it, my fingers trembling, not quite believing what I was seeing. As I picked it up, a sudden flash of memory hit me, a face, a voice. Clara. The name echoed through my mind, and panic surged again, sharp and immediate. But I shoved it down. It's just a necklace. Just a dream. Still, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that something was wrong. The necklace was cold to the touch, icy even, like it had been lying in a freezer. I set it down carefully on the nightstand, my hands unsteady. A strange noise caught my attention. At first, it was a whispering, a soft rustling sound, like wind through leaves. But then it became something else, something louder, more insistent. Like footsteps. My blood ran cold. My heart stuttered in my chest. I stood up abruptly, turning toward the door. No, I wasn't going to do this again. The last thing I needed was to give in to whatever madness was happening. But the footsteps, they were unmistakable. There was no way I could pretend they were just a figment of my imagination. They were coming from behind the door. Slow, deliberate, like someone or something was just waiting for me to react. I backed away from the door, moving toward the window. The sound of the steps grew louder, closer. I could almost hear the weight shifting, the subtle creak of the floorboards, the soft exhale of breath. The lavender scent intensified again, making it harder to breathe. The walls felt as though they were closing in, like the room was shrinking, squeezing the air out of it, pushing me closer to something, waiting. I reached for the window, hoping for an escape. But when I looked out, the street outside was strange. The cars were in the wrong places, the streetlights flickering in patterns that felt wrong, too familiar. I couldn't place it at first, but then the realization hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't the street outside my window. It wasn't my neighborhood. It was the same scene from the dream, the same street, the same dim lights casting long, unnatural shadows. No, this isn't happening. This can't be happening. I turned back toward the door, but I didn't need to look. Something told me that the figure was there. It had to be. The footsteps were louder now, no longer a vague noise in the background. They were right outside the door, growing closer with each passing second. I should have run. I should have screamed for help. But I couldn't move. My feet were glued to the floor. I felt my pulse pounding in my ears. Sweat beaded on my forehead. The room was getting warmer, then colder again, as if the temperature was fluctuating by the second. The walls seemed to pulse with each beat of my heart. Suddenly, the door rattled, and my breath hitched. The figure, whatever it was on the other side. I could feel its presence seeping through the walls, pressing on me, as if it were already here. Then, the footsteps stopped. Silence. I didn't know how long I stood there, holding my breath, listening for anything. A sound. A movement. But the silence stretched on. Then, out of nowhere, I felt it. a cold breath against the back of my neck. The hair on my arm stood up as a chill shot down my spine. Slowly, I turned, and there it was, right in front of me. The figure. It was taller now, almost towering over me, its shape more solid, its edges sharper. But it was still featureless, still shrouded in shadow, its presence overwhelming. Its form wavered in the dim light, as if it could slip in and out of reality itself. Clara. The name echoed again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a scream, a voice that reverberated through my head, making my skull ache. I backed away, my heart hammering, my legs shaking beneath me. But there was no place to hide, no escape. I reached out, my hands trembling as I felt for something, anything, just to hold on to. But the floor beneath my feet was no longer solid. It felt like I was standing on a shifting surface, like the very foundation of the house had come undone. Then, the figure moved. It was faster this time, its motions fluid, like it was part of the air, part of the room. It stretched toward me, its long, shadowy fingers brushing against my skin. I recoiled instinctively, but it was too late. The touch was cold, freezing. And as soon as its fingers made contact, everything went dark. I didn't know how long I was unconscious. The darkness swallowed me whole, consuming everything, leaving me with no sense of time, no sense of self. When I finally opened my eyes, the world was unfamiliar. I was no longer in my room. The walls were a faded shade of blue, peeling at the corners, and the ceiling above me was low, too low. The air felt different, thick, and dry. It smelled faintly of mildew and dust. I sat up, my body aching as if I'd been lying on a hard surface for hours, days, maybe. My hands scraped against the floor as I tried to push myself upright. My head spun, the room tilting around me. I didn't know where I was. I glanced around. The room was small, sparse, almost like a cellar. A single flickering bulb dangled from the ceiling, casting long shadows on the cracked walls. It was cold, colder than I'd ever felt. What happened? The question hit me like a punch to the gut. I blinked rapidly, trying to shake off the grogginess, but my mind was foggy, like I was trying to see through thick glass. A low, guttural hum filled the space, like an electrical buzz, distant and unsettling. I followed the sound, moving toward the far corner of the room, where an old-fashioned mirror stood against the wall. No, it can't be. My breath caught in my throat. The mirror. It was identical to the one in my room. The one where I had seen the shadow. The one where the figure had appeared. I moved toward it, my body stiff with fear, the hairs on the back of my neck standing at attention. As I got closer, the buzzing grew louder, more pronounced. What is happening? I didn't want to look into it, but something pulled me closer, a magnetic force I couldn't resist. My reflection flickered in the dim light, just a shadow at first. But then it became clearer, too clear. The figure from my dreams, the one I had just barely escaped, was there. It was standing behind me, just like before. I spun around, heart racing, pulse thudding in my temples. But no one was there. The room was empty. I faced the mirror again, and there it was, its form more solid than before. Its features were still indistinct, but the shape was unmistakable. It was watching me. Waiting. I reached for the mirror, my fingers trembling as they hovered just inches from the glass. Is this real? The buzzing noise intensified. My reflection, no, it wasn't me anymore, twisted in the glass. The figure behind me moved in time with my every shift, its shadow stretching unnaturally long. Its body leaned forward, its face obscured, but the eyes were there. They were dark, hollow, almost empty, staring at me with an intensity that made my stomach churn. Suddenly, I felt it, like the air had thickened. The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in, suffocating me. The buzzing was deafening now, overwhelming. I wanted to scream, to break free, but my voice was gone, trapped in my throat. It's coming for me. I stumbled backward, but my feet tangled beneath me, sending me crashing to the floor. My head collided with the hard surface, stars exploding in front of my eyes. I shook my head, trying to clear the disorientation. The buzzing stopped. A deafening silence followed, thick and suffocating. And then I heard it. A voice. Soft at first, but clear and piercing in the silence. Wake up. I froze. The voice wasn't mine. It wasn't human. It was cold, metallic, like something or someone trying to pull me out of my body. Wake up. The voice repeated. Louder now, sharper. I scrambled to my feet, panic surging through me. My hands gripped the mirror's edge, my knuckles white. I tried to pull myself away from it, but my reflection wouldn't let me go. It was dragging me back, pulling me deeper into the glass. Wake up. It wasn't just a voice anymore. I could feel it in my bones, in my chest, pressing against my rib cage. The pain was unbearable. The air was heavy, too thick to breathe. My body shook, my legs unsteady beneath me. And then everything snapped. I gasped. My eyes shot open, and I was back in my room. But it didn't feel like my room anymore. The walls were warped, the furniture blurred at the edges, as if reality itself had started to fray, like a thread unraveling. The lavender scent had returned, stronger than before, stinging my nostrils. I stumbled out of bed, dizzy and disoriented. The mirror on the wall reflected a distorted version of me, not me. The edges of my reflection bled out, rippling like water disturbed by an unseen force. What is happening to me? I reached out for the mirror, but I couldn't touch it. It felt like a boundary I couldn't cross, like something that would drag me in if I dared. My breath came in ragged gasps. The room felt wrong. The air pressed against me, suffocating. I couldn't tell if I was awake or still dreaming. The line between them had blurred until it was indistinguishable. And then I heard it again. A whisper. Soft. Insistent. Wake up. I turned to run, but the room stretched, pulling me in every direction. The walls were closing in again. The floor beneath me felt like it was shifting. There was no escape, no way out. Wake up. I couldn't tell if the voice was coming from inside my head or from the mirror. And then I saw it. The reflection, no, not mine. It was staring at me. The same dark, hollow eyes. It wasn't a dream. It was something worse. Have you ever heard something you couldn't explain? Something so real yet so impossible that you doubted your own senses? I did. And it's changed everything. It was late, the kind of late when the whole world feels asleep except for the creaks and groans of an old house. My house. The silence was thick, almost too much to bear. The clock ticked on the wall, the soft sound almost too loud in the stillness. The air was cool, a slight breeze drifting through the window, carrying the scent of rain. I had just finished reading, trying to unwind before bed. The book was boring, nothing more than background noise to my tired mind. I had spent the last few hours alone, which was typical. There was a comfort in solitude, a kind of peace. I didn't mind being by myself. But then I heard it. At first, it was nothing more than a faint rustling sound, like a curtain blowing in the wind. I didn't think much of it at first. The window was open a crack, and I had grown used to the sounds of the night creeping in. But this was different. It wasn't just the wind. There was something else, something alive, almost. A soft scraping, like fingernails brushing against fabric. My heart rate picked up, and I sat up straighter, my eyes narrowing toward the sound. I told myself it was nothing. Probably just the breeze, right? But I couldn't shake the feeling. I turned my head toward the window, where the curtains were drawn. That's why I saw it. The faintest movement, just a shadow behind the fabric, shifting in a way that didn't match the flow of the wind. My breath caught in my throat. I sat frozen for a moment, waiting. Nothing. I convinced myself that I had imagined it. It had to have been the wind, or maybe the house settling. The thought of checking felt ridiculous, so I stayed where I was, still and silent, watching the curtains. But then it happened again. A slow, deliberate movement. The shadow was closer now, almost as if it was reaching toward the edge of the curtains. My skin prickled with unease. I didn't move. I couldn't. For a few seconds, all I could hear was the sound of my own heartbeat pounding in my chest, a steady rhythm that seemed too loud. My mind raced, trying to justify what I was seeing, or what I thought I was seeing. The rustling continued, a bit louder now. The shape behind the curtain shifted again, and I swore it was closer this time. I had to know. Slowly, I stood up, my legs stiff from sitting too long. My breath was shallow, my body tense. Every instinct told me not to look, not to move. But my curiosity got the best of me. I had to check. I took one step forward, and the sound stopped. The sudden silence was deafening, making my pulse race even faster. I hesitated, the fear creeping up my spine, making it hard to breathe. What if it's nothing? What if I'm just being paranoid? But I couldn't stop now. With trembling hands, I reached for the curtain, my fingers brushing the cool fabric. The rustling sound was gone, but the air felt thick, oppressive. I pulled the curtain aside quickly, expecting to see the empty space behind it. But there was nothing. No person, no animal, nothing that could explain the movement I had seen. Just a wall. I stared at the empty space, a wave of relief washing over me. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe it was just the shadows playing tricks. But as I stepped back, something caught my eye. There, on the floor, right where the curtain had been, were footprints. I blinked, staring at the fresh, dark imprints on the hardwood floor. They were small, like the soles of bare feet, and they led straight toward the window. I hadn't heard any footsteps. I hadn't felt anyone enter the room. I looked around, my breath caught in my throat. The door to the room was still closed. The window was locked. There was no way anyone could have come in without me hearing. But the footprints were there, unmistakable, right in front of me. What the hell? I knelt down, running my fingers lightly over the marks. The floor was cold, but would smooth under my touch. But the prints weren't fading. They were fresh. I stood up quickly, my mind racing, my body tense. I should have called someone. I should have done something. But I couldn't bring myself to move. The air around me felt heavy, thick with something I couldn't name. I kept my eyes on the marks, but something inside me told me to leave. To get out of that room, away from whatever had made those footprints. I backed away slowly, never turning my back to the floor. As I reached the door, I heard it again. The rustling. But this time, it was louder. More distinct. And I wasn't imagining it. I looked back at the curtains. The shadow was there again, pressing against the fabric, moving closer. I didn't wait to see what happened next. I bolted from the room, slamming the door behind me. And I didn't go back. I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. Every time I closed my eyes, all I could see was that shadow, pushing against the curtains, reaching out like it wanted to touch me. My heart would race, my body tensed, and I would open my eyes again, only to find myself staring into the familiar darkness of my bedroom. But the silence was deafening. Too silent. I kept replaying the footprints in my mind, the soft, damp imprints on the floor, leading toward the window. I didn't understand. How could something be there, and yet I never heard it? How could there be footprints, but no one had entered the room? The next morning, I tried to shake it off. It had to have been a trick of the light, or maybe I had just imagined the whole thing in my tired state. I told myself I was just stressed, my mind playing games with me. I had no reason to believe something strange was actually happening. But deep down, I couldn't ignore the unease that gnawed at me. I forced myself to go about my day as usual. I took a shower, made some coffee, and sat down to work. But the feeling didn't leave. The air felt heavier, thicker. Even though the sun was out, it seemed like there was something lurking in every corner of the room. I would catch myself glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see something there. Every little sound made me jump. A door creaking. The wind brushing against the window. I had to keep checking every few minutes just to reassure myself that nothing was there. But the more I checked, the more the feeling grew. Something was wrong, something was hiding. And then, at about midday, it happened again. I was sitting on the couch, typing away on my laptop, when I heard it, just the faintest rustle. My fingers froze over the keyboard. I didn't move at first. It wasn't the wind this time. It wasn't the usual house creaks either. It was something more deliberate, more alive. I could feel my pulse quicken in my throat. Slowly, I turned my head, expecting to see the curtains. But this time, there was something more. A subtle shift, like the fabric moved on its own. My heart skipped a beat. I hadn't moved the curtains. I had made sure they were in place before I had sat down. But now, there was a noticeable gap. The fabric parted just slightly, enough to reveal a sliver of the wall beyond. I stood up, my hands trembling. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave the room, but my legs felt like they were stuck in place. The rustling continued, gentle and persistent, as if something, or someone, was just beyond my reach. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. Slowly, I took a step closer to the window. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with something I couldn't quite name. My hand hovered over the edge of the curtain. "Please don't let it be real," I whispered to myself, but I knew it was already too late. With one sharp motion, I pulled the curtain back. Nothing. The same empty wall. The same empty room. Just the faint daylight filtering through the window. No shadow. No movement. But then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The footprints. They were there again, only now they were different. They weren't the same ones I had seen last night. These were smaller, more numerous, and they seemed to be scattered. They didn't follow the same path as before. No, these prints were spread out, almost as if something had moved in a frenzy, scrambling across the floor. And they weren't just on the wooden floor anymore. They were on the carpet too. And on the walls. In places where there was no way a human could have reached. I staggered back, my breath coming in short gasps. How? How could this be happening? Who or what had done this? A chill ran down my spine as I felt something behind me. The hairs on my neck stood up. I wasn't alone. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I just stood there, frozen in place. My whole body screamed at me to run, to get out of there. But I felt paralyzed, as though my legs were no longer mine. And then, I heard it. A voice. It was soft at first, just a whisper against the silence. Leave. My heart pounded in my chest. Leave, the voice repeated, clearer this time. It was coming from behind me. I didn't dare turn. I couldn't. My feet shuffled backwards slowly, inching toward the door. The voice wasn't threatening. It wasn't angry. It was pleading. Desperate. But I didn't understand. Who was it? What did they want? I didn't wait to find out. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and slamming it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, gasping for air, my mind a storm of confusion and fear. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, my body shaking. I had to leave. I had to get out of that house. But I couldn't. I didn't know where to go. I didn't know what was happening, and I was terrified of what might happen next. But even more than that, I was terrified of the thing that was waiting behind the curtains. I didn't want to go back there. But I knew, deep down, that I would have to. I spent the rest of the afternoon pacing around the house, trying to distract myself from the mounting dread that clung to every corner of the room. I couldn't go back in there, not yet. Every time I thought about the footprints, the whisper, I felt the tightness in my chest grow stronger. Something was watching me, and I had no idea what it wanted or why it was happening. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I grabbed it, desperate for anything to pull me away from this nightmare, but when I saw the message, I froze. It was from my friend, Emma. Hey, I've been thinking about you. Are you doing okay? You didn't respond to my last message. Let me know if you need anything. Her words seemed so ordinary, so normal. I stared at the text, feeling a strange sense of calm wash over me, even though my mind was still in chaos. Maybe I just needed to talk to someone, to tell someone what was going on. Maybe then it would all make sense. But just as I was about to reply, I heard it again. That sound. That faint rustling. It came from the living room. I stiffened, my eyes widening in horror. My heart began to hammer in my chest again. I hadn't moved. I hadn't opened the curtains, but somehow, I knew it was happening again. I glanced around the kitchen, looking for something to defend myself with, but there was nothing. The rustling continued, faint but persistent, like something, or someone, was gently pushing against the fabric. I stood frozen for a moment, my pulse racing, my mind reeling. Was I imagining it? No. The sound was real. It was unmistakable. The whisper had stopped, but now a new noise filled the air, a soft, almost imperceptible tapping. A rhythmic, deliberate sound. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from behind the curtains. I didn't want to look. I didn't want to confirm that my worst fear was true, but I couldn't help myself. The curiosity, the terror, both clawed at me, pushing me forward. I forced my legs to move, slow and reluctant, toward the living room. Every step felt heavier than the last, the air thicker, suffocating with the weight of something that I could barely understand. I stopped in front of the window, staring at the curtains, now gently shifting as though in response to my presence. The tapping had stopped, replaced by the soft hiss of fabric moving in the air. For a moment, everything was still. The room seemed to hold its breath. The sunlight that had filtered through the window earlier now seemed muted, as if it, too, was afraid of what was hidden behind those curtains. And then I heard it again. The whisper. Leave. The voice was different this time. It was louder, more insistent. It wasn't just a plea anymore, it was an order. I took a step back. My legs were shaking, and I could feel the sweat beading on my forehead. I should have listened to it, should have run far away from this place, but the part of me that still clung to logic, no matter how broken, forced me to take one last look. I reached out, trembling, and grabbed the edge of the curtain. And I pulled. The room was empty. The same empty room I had left earlier. But this time, the floor was covered with something new. The footprints. But they weren't just on the floor. They were on the walls. The ceiling. And they seemed to be moving. My breath hitched in my throat as I stumbled backward, eyes wide in disbelief. The marks, they weren't just footprints. They were claw marks. Long, jagged gouges in the wood and carpet. They seemed fresh, like whatever had left them was still here, somewhere in the room, watching me. I turned to run, but then I heard something that made my blood run cold. A loud, sharp scrape. It was coming from the ceiling. I looked up just in time to see a dark shape slide along the wall. A blur. Something large, something unnatural. I didn't wait to see what it was. I didn't need to. I ran. The sound of my footsteps echoed in the hallway as I bolted toward the front door. The door that I had left unlocked in my panic earlier. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely grip the doorknob. I twisted it, my heart pounding in my throat, and the door finally gave way, slamming open into the evening air. I stumbled outside, gasping for breath, my eyes darting back to the house. The wind blew through the trees, but the rustling had stopped. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then, just before I turned to run, I saw it. A figure, standing motionless in the window. It wasn't a shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was watching me. And the worst part? It wasn't behind the curtains anymore. It was standing right in front of the window, staring directly at me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its eyes on me, cold and unblinking. I ran. My legs felt like lead as I ran down the driveway, my heart hammering in my chest. I didn't dare to look back, but the image of that thing, standing there, in the window, refused to leave my mind. It felt too real, too close. A chill crawled down my spine as I forced my legs to move faster, pushing myself further into the night, away from the house. I could still hear it in my head, the scrape of claws on the ceiling, the voice, and the unmistakable presence lurking just behind the walls, behind the curtains. The house felt like it was alive with something malignant, something that was only waiting for the right moment to strike. I didn't know where I was going, didn't care. I just had to get away. My breath came in ragged gasps as I reached the end of the street, the familiar lights of the neighborhood doing nothing to ease the creeping dread that had taken over me. It felt as though the night itself was watching, the darkness pressing in from all sides. I pulled out my phone again, hands trembling, trying to steady my mind. I couldn't be alone in this. I needed to talk to someone, anyone who could help me make sense of what was happening. But when I opened my messages, I saw something that made my stomach turn. The last message I had sent to Emma had been sent just a few minutes ago. The timestamp on her response, however, said it had been delivered hours ago. "Hey, I've been thinking about you. Are you doing okay?" I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something was wrong. How could she have sent that message hours ago if I had just received it now? A sudden gust of wind swept through the street, the trees groaning in response. I glanced around, shivering, trying to shake the feeling that something was closing in on me. My phone buzzed again, pulling me from my thoughts. It was another message from Emma. "You need to come home. It's not safe there anymore." I read the words over and over, my brain scrambling for a rational explanation. How could she know? She didn't know anything about what had been happening. No one did. So why would she send a message like that? A feeling, cold and heavy, settled over me as I stared at the screen. I needed to get back to my house, to figure out what was going on, but the idea of going back, of facing whatever was lurking there, sent a wave of panic through me. I glanced at the street behind me, half expecting to see a shadow slip through the darkness. I wasn't sure if I was being followed, or if my fear was just making things worse, but it didn't matter. The unease gnawing at my insides told me that there was no escaping this. I had to go back. I had to find out what was happening. But as I turned, a strange thought crossed my mind. What if it's not just my house? What if whatever was in there was already spreading? What if it had found its way into everything around me? The air grew colder, a biting chill creeping along my skin as I walked back down the street. Each step felt heavier than the last, as though the weight of whatever was happening was pressing down on me with every breath I took. When I finally reached the door to my house, I hesitated. My fingers hovered over the doorknob, and for a moment, I thought about turning back. I thought about running as far as I could, leaving everything behind and never looking back. But then I heard it. A soft rustling, just like before. It came from inside the house. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, my mind on edge. The house was silent, too silent. The kind of silence that felt unnatural, like it was holding its breath, waiting for something. I stepped carefully into the living room, my eyes scanning the space, looking for any sign of movement. The curtains were drawn, but I could still feel the weight of them pressing against me, like something was just waiting to push through. I stepped forward, my feet brushing against the hardwood floor. And that's when I saw it. The claw marks. They were still there, all over the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. They seemed to stretch out, leading toward the window. I stepped closer, my heart in my throat. My eyes locked onto something in the corner of the room. It was a small, crumpled note. I reached down and picked it up, the edges soft and torn as though it had been there for a while. My fingers trembled as I turned it over. It wasn't the note that terrified me, but the message written in jagged, uneven handwriting. "It's already here. It's watching you." The blood drained from my face. I felt like I was suffocating, as though the walls were closing in around me. My chest tightened, panic rising in my throat. The whispering voice returned, but this time it was louder, clearer. Leave. I spun around, expecting to see something, but the room remained empty. That's when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, dragging across the floor behind me. I didn't need to turn around. I didn't need to see what was there. I just ran. I didn't care if I made noise. I didn't care if I woke up the whole neighborhood. I didn't care about anything except getting away. But as I reached the door, I froze. The door, it was closed. From the inside. I hadn't closed it. The house was locked. And something was still inside with me. The cold metal of the door handle burned against my palm. I jerked it again, my fingers slick with sweat. The door didn't budge. It was locked from the inside. The sound of slow, shuffling footsteps echoed from somewhere deep in the house. They weren't in the living room. No, they were coming from further back, from the hallway that led to the bedrooms. I knew every inch of this place. I had lived here for years. But tonight, everything felt foreign, as if the house was a stranger's, twisting and shifting in ways I didn't understand. My heart was beating so loudly that I couldn't think straight. Get out. Get out. Get out. My mind screamed the words, but my body refused to cooperate. I took one more desperate pull at the door handle, but it was useless. The door wouldn't open. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to come up with a plan. Should I find something to break the glass? Should I scream for help? Who would help me? The thought hit me like a wave of ice-cold water. I was alone. I had to confront whatever was here, whatever was stalking me inside my own home. I turned and scanned the room, my eyes darting to every corner. The curtains. They swayed slightly, though there was no wind. That same feeling crept back into my chest, the sensation of something watching me from behind those dark folds. It wasn't just the curtains that had changed. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed deeper, stretching unnaturally long. The air itself felt thicker, heavier. I couldn't breathe properly. The footsteps stopped. It was deathly quiet, except for the frantic pounding of my heart in my ears. I hesitated, trying to decide my next move. My phone was still in my pocket, but I had already texted everyone I could think of. No response. The one message from Emma still burned in my mind: you need to come home. It's not safe there anymore. It's not safe there anymore. Those words didn't make sense. How did she know? How did anyone know what was happening to me? And why? Why had I not heard them sooner? I heard it again, the low, dragging sound, but this time it was closer. Too close. I froze, holding my breath. My muscles locked up as I turned toward the hallway. For a moment, I swore I saw something move in the shadows. Something small. It was quick, too quick, but my eyes caught the flicker of movement, like a shadow darting across the floor. I stumbled back, my heart leaping into my throat. No. No, no, no. I couldn't explain it. I didn't want to explain it. The rational part of my mind was screaming, telling me I was just imagining things, that this wasn't real. But my senses, every single one of them, were telling me otherwise. There was something in this house with me. I spun around and bolted for the nearest window. I didn't care anymore. I had to get out. The house was closing on me, and I could feel it tightening around me like a trap. I flung the window open with one hand, my fingers shaking as I struggled to get it open. The air outside felt different, brisk, cold, almost suffocating. But it was freedom. As I climbed out of the window, I felt a sharp, sudden pain in my side. My breath caught. What was that? I glanced down, only for my stomach to lurch in horror. There, on the windowsill, was a handprint, fresh and wet. But it wasn't mine. It was small, slim, as if a child had pressed their hand against the glass. I stumbled back, nearly falling, my chest tight with panic. But I didn't have time to think. I needed to get away from the house, from whatever was hunting me inside. The dark presence I could feel, creeping toward me with every step, was too much. It was too close. I ran, hard, faster than I ever had before. I didn't stop until I was halfway down the street, gasping for air, my legs like jelly. But even then, I couldn't escape it. The feeling that I wasn't alone. I glanced back at the house. The lights in the windows flickered. It was as if something, or someone, was watching me from inside. I couldn't stop myself. I turned and ran back toward it, my mind screaming at me to turn around, but my feet ignored it. I don't know why I went back. Maybe it was to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. Maybe it was to make sure that I wasn't imagining everything. But when I stepped into the yard, something felt wrong. I couldn't see any movement in the windows, but I could feel it, this weight pressing against me. There was something just out of sight, just beyond the edge of my vision. And the air felt thicker, colder. I reached for the front door. This time, it didn't feel locked. It opened without resistance. As I stepped inside, I saw it. A shadow. At first, I thought it was my imagination. But no, it moved. Slowly. Crawling out from the corner of the living room. Something was there. It wasn't human. It wasn't anything I could recognize. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I tried to turn around, to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place. The thing moved toward me, its form indistinct, as if made of smoke or darkness itself. And then I heard it. A whisper. You shouldn't have come back. My skin went cold. My body trembled. I don't know how I made it out. I don't know how I am still alive. But when I reached the street again, I looked back one last time. The curtains were moving. And behind them, two eyes were watching me. Have you ever seen something you couldn't explain? Something that seemed almost real, but not quite? I'm asking because last night I saw something that still haunts me. And I don't know if it was a trick of the light or if I was losing my mind. It was around midnight. I was standing under the flickering street lamp just outside my apartment. It was one of those nights where the air feels too still, the silence pressing down on you like a weight. You know the kind where every sound, no matter how small, feels amplified. The hum of the streetlight, the faint rustle of leaves, the soft shuffle of my own footsteps as I paced nervously. I should have gone inside. But something kept me out there. I glanced down at my shadow, stretching long on the pavement beneath me, distorted by the dim light. But then, something was off. My shadow, it moved differently. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Maybe it was just the wind, shifting the shadows. But no, it was more than that. I stood there, frozen, watching. My own reflection, my shadow, lifted its hand. But I hadn't moved. My own hand was still by my side. It wasn't me. It wasn't my hand. It seemed to linger there for a moment, reaching up as if to touch something unseen in the air. My heart skipped a beat, and I took a step back, telling myself it was just a trick of perception. I'm tired. I'm just tired. That was all. But the longer I stood there, the more unsettling it became. I could see it clearly now. My shadow was alive, in a way. And it wasn't following my movements anymore. It was doing its own thing. The way it moved didn't match me. What the hell is happening? The air seemed to thicken around me, the quiet pressing against my ears like a heavy weight. I tried to move, but my body was frozen. My feet felt like they were stuck in place. I couldn't tear my eyes away from my shadow. It's not possible. Shadows can't move like this. They can't act on their own. But there it was, distinct and terrifying, just out of sync with my own motions. It reached out again, this time with more purpose. Slowly, it crept toward me. No. No, no, no. I wanted to run. My breath became shallow, each inhalation a struggle. But I couldn't move. My legs were stiff, my mind racing with confusion. I turned my head quickly to the side, half expecting to see someone else, standing behind me, controlling the shadow, making it do these things. But the street was empty. There was no one there. The shadow reached further, closer, closer still, and then it suddenly stopped. For a long moment, nothing moved. The only sound was the soft hum of the street lamp, flickering faintly above me. I tried to take a step forward, but it felt as if the pavement beneath me had turned to quicksand. My feet couldn't find purchase. And then I heard it. A soft whisper. It wasn't in my ear. It wasn't from any direction at all. It was a feeling more than a sound, a vibration in the air that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. You can't run. The voice was wrong. It wasn't human. It was more like a thought rather than a sound. It didn't feel like it was coming from anywhere. It felt like it was inside my head. What was that? I whipped around, panic clawing at my chest, only to find the street empty. Again. But the shadow was still there. I stared at it, rooted in place, unable to look away. It moved again, but this time, it was different. It wasn't just mimicking my movements. It was acting independently. Its form started to shift, warping as if the very air around it was bending to its will. The outline of its figure became jagged, distorted, as though it wasn't made of light and dark, but something else entirely. Something much darker. I stepped back again, my heart pounding in my chest, and that's when I realized I couldn't see my own feet. I looked down. There was nothing. My shadow had swallowed me whole. I had no reflection. No form. I wasn't standing there anymore. Just the empty pavement and the flickering streetlight. My heart skipped a beat. My breath hitched. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. It felt as though the air had been sucked from my lungs. And then I saw it. From the darkness of my shadow, two hands, not mine, reached out, crawling along the pavement toward me. They were coming for me. The ground beneath me felt like it was pulling me down, as though the earth itself was alive, dragging me into the depths of the darkness. In one panic motion, I jerked my head away, snapping myself out of the trance, and stumbled backwards. My feet hit the ground again, solid, and my shadow, my real shadow, slammed into place with a harsh jerk. I gasped for air, heart hammering in my chest. I turned and ran, faster than I ever had before, not stopping until I was far away, my legs aching, my mind swirling with confusion. It was impossible. It had to be. But as I ran, I kept thinking about that whisper. You can't run. I couldn't sleep that night. My body was too tense, my thoughts too erratic. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the shadow, the hands reaching out from it, crawling closer and closer. And that whisper. You can't run. I couldn't stop hearing it. It was echoing in my mind, like a warning. No matter how hard I tried to ignore it, the words refused to leave. I spent the rest of the night pacing around my apartment, trying to make sense of what had happened. It was impossible, wasn't it? Shadows weren't alive. They didn't move on their own. There had to be a logical explanation, right? But every time I looked at the floor, at the corners of the room where the shadows stretched, I felt that unease crawl back up my spine. My eyes darted around, expecting to see something move, but there was nothing except the lingering sensation that I was being watched. It was only when the sun finally began to rise that I dared to lie down. But sleep didn't come. Instead, I spent the hours staring at the ceiling, my heart still racing from the memory of that whisper, of the hands that weren't mine. I thought about going to the police, or at least telling someone. But who could I trust with something like this? They'd think I was crazy. I thought I was crazy. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I kept seeing something in the corners of my vision, but every time I turned around, there was nothing there. Just the world moving on, indifferent to the fear that had begun to consume me. At one point, I tried to tell myself it was just a stress-induced hallucination. Maybe I had too much on my mind. Maybe I hadn't been sleeping enough. But deep down, I knew better. This wasn't just in my head. I could feel it. Something had happened, and it wasn't something I could explain away. I decided to return to the street lamp. I don't know why, but it felt like I needed to confront it, to face whatever was there. Maybe I thought I could make sense of it. Maybe I thought I could prove to myself that I hadn't lost my mind. That night, I stood in front of the lamp again, staring down at my feet, half expecting to see that same distorted shadow. The air was still, just like before. There was no wind, no sounds except for the distant hum of the city. I stared at the ground for what felt like an eternity. But nothing moved. The pavement was empty, silent, the shadows stretching harmlessly around me. I breathed a sigh of relief. Maybe it had been a one-time thing. Maybe I was just imagining it. But then, just as I was about to turn and leave, I saw it. A flicker. Just a flash of movement in the corner of my eye. I whipped around, and there it was. My shadow. But it wasn't where it should have been. It was stretched too far, pulled out of shape by the harsh light of the street lamp. And then it moved. Not the way it should have. It was jerky, as if it was trying to move in a direction of its own, independent of my movements. The fingers on the ground twitched, and I felt a chill run up my spine. My breath caught in my throat as I watched my shadow do something it shouldn't have. It lifted its arm. But it wasn't my arm. I didn't do it. I couldn't move. I was frozen again, unable to tear my gaze away. The shadow's hand stretched out further, creeping toward me. But this time, it wasn't just a hand. It was a shape. The outline of something behind me, just out of sight. I couldn't see it, not directly, but I could feel it. It was there, just beyond the reach of the lamplight, shifting and twisting as if it were watching me. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything, but my body wouldn't respond. It was as though I was trapped in place, anchored to the spot by the force of my own fear. And then the whisper came again. "You can't escape." The voice seemed to echo from everywhere, from the very air around me. It wasn't real. It couldn't be. But I could feel it. I could feel the presence of something otherworldly just on the edge of my perception. I had to move. I had to get away. But just as I turned to flee, the street light above me flickered violently. The shadows around me stretched in impossible directions, as if they were reaching out, trying to grab hold of me. I sprinted away, my heart pounding in my chest, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I didn't stop until I was back inside my apartment, locked away from whatever that was. But even then, I couldn't escape it. I could still feel the weight of those unseen hands, the pull of the shadow, following me. It wasn't gone. It was waiting. And I don't know how much longer I can keep running. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone anymore. Even in the safety of my own home, I could sense it, something lurking just out of sight. I hadn't been able to sleep since that night by the street lamp, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw that shadow. The way it stretched and contorted, alive in a way I couldn't understand. That whisper, "You can't escape." I could hear it even when there was no sound. It gnawed at my thoughts like a parasite, burrowing deeper every time I tried to ignore it. I tried to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me. Stress, lack of sleep, maybe even the anxiety of being alone too long. But deep down, I knew it wasn't my imagination. This was real. The first thing I did was check my apartment, every room, every corner. I went through the motions, opening cabinets, peering under tables, behind curtains. But there was nothing. Nothing that would explain the unease curling around my stomach, or the way the air felt too thick, too still. It's strange, isn't it? How a place can feel so familiar, so safe, but in a single moment, it can turn foreign. The walls of my apartment felt like they were closing in. The windows, once transparent and welcoming, seemed to have transformed into barriers, trapping me inside. I even started second-guessing my own reflection. When I finally sat down, exhausted and terrified, I thought about what I had seen. The shadow. How it had moved when I hadn't. How it had followed me, even after I tried to run. I couldn't ignore it anymore. I didn't know what to do. I didn't know where to turn. My phone was lying beside me, but I couldn't bring myself to call anyone. Who would believe me? How could I explain the unexplainable? I had to find out more. I couldn't just live in fear, not knowing what was happening to me. I needed answers. But what kind of answers was I even looking for? I didn't know how long I sat there, trying to think, but something snapped me out of my daze. A soft, barely audible sound, like the creak of wood. I looked toward the window, the curtains drawn tight, but the faintest light slipped through the cracks. I could hear it now, scratching against the wall. It wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside. I held my breath, straining to listen. The sound came again. Faint, but undeniable. SCRRCH. I didn't want to move. I didn't want to look. But my body seemed to betray me as I slowly stood up. I crept toward the source of the noise, my heart hammering in my chest. I reached the wall and pressed my ear to it. Silence. The scratching had stopped. But there was something in the air. It felt wrong. It felt like something had shifted, like reality had bent just a little. I knew it couldn't be real, but it felt real. My head spun. My mind screamed at me to leave, to get out of there and never come back. But I couldn't. I had to know what was going on. I had to understand what was happening to me. I turned and walked slowly toward the closet, the door creaking open with a slight protest. Inside, my coat hung, the only thing in the small space. But that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the shadow. It was different now. The shape was larger, more distorted than I remembered. The way it moved was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to make my blood run cold. There was something wrong with it. It wasn't my shadow anymore. I reached out, half expecting my hand to pass through the darkness. But as my fingers brushed the fabric of my coat, I felt the coldness, the oppressive, unnatural chill that seemed to emanate from the shadow itself. It was like it was alive, breathing, pulsing in a way that didn't belong in the world I knew. I pulled my hand back, heart racing. I couldn't explain it. My shadow was alive. It had become something else, something far worse than I ever imagined. And then I saw it. Not in the reflection of the mirror, not in the corner of my eye, but there, standing just behind me in the dark. It was a shape, like a figure, stretching toward me from the depths of the shadow. It had no features, no clear lines. Just a mass of shifting blackness. My breath caught in my throat as it loomed closer, as if it had been waiting for me to notice. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My legs felt like they were made of stone, my body frozen in place by fear. And then, that voice again. You can't escape. It was different this time, more guttural, more real. It didn't come from anywhere specific, it just filled the space around me, crawling under my skin, making my heart race. I could feel it now, deep within me, like it had always been there. Like I had always been meant to hear it. I slammed the closet door shut and backed away, my chest heaving. I couldn't take my eyes off the space where that shape had been. I tried to shake the image from my mind, but it lingered, haunting the edges of my vision. I had to leave. I had to get away. But as I turned to run, I froze again. The door. The front door to my apartment, it was wide open. Had I left it open? My feet wouldn't move. My eyes darted between the dark hallway and the open door. There was no sound, no movement. But I could feel it, something was out there. Watching. And that shadow? It wasn't just a shadow anymore. It was following me. The door was still open. It felt like the world had stopped. My breath was shallow, my heart pounding. I couldn't move, couldn't think. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't tear my eyes away from the gaping doorway. The darkness on the other side seemed to stretch endlessly, like it was swallowing the hallway and pulling it into something else, something that didn't belong. Why was the door open? I was sure I had locked it earlier. I had been sure. But now, standing there in the half-light, the hallway beyond seemed foreign. It felt wrong, as if the apartment, the place that had been home for so long, was no longer the same. It felt like a prison. But it wasn't just the door. No, it was the shadow. That shape. That thing. It wasn't just lurking anymore. It was here. In this room. I could feel it, its presence hovering in the air like a cold, oppressive weight. It was behind me. It was beside me. It was everywhere. I slowly turned around, keeping my back to the wall, afraid to lose sight of the door and the endless dark behind it. My gaze flickered around the apartment, looking for anything that could explain what was happening. But everything was ordinary. Nothing was out of place. The lamp by the couch, the dishes in the sink, the books scattered across the table. But then I saw it. A flicker. Just a movement, too quick to follow. A shift in the corner of the room. The shadow. It had moved. I didn't know how, but I could see it clearly now, its tendrils stretching toward me like it was reaching, crawling across the floor. No longer a mere reflection, it was an entity of its own, separate from me, but tied to me in ways I couldn't comprehend. It wasn't mimicking me anymore. No, this shadow, this thing, had a mind of its own. And it was growing. I could feel it. It was feeding off my fear, growing stronger with every second that passed. It had no face, no eyes, but I knew it was watching me, waiting for me to break, to run, to make a mistake. I stepped back, my feet unsteady. My pulse raced. The air felt heavier with each breath, like the very space around me was thickening, tightening. The more I looked at it, the more I felt it, like something was crawling underneath my skin, trying to claw its way out. I had to get out. I had to do something. I turned toward the door. But just as I moved, the shadow shifted again. It wasn't just a shape anymore. It was alive. It was real. It stretched across the room as though it were pulling itself toward me with purpose. The longer I stared, the more the edges of the darkness seemed to bend and twist. A shape was forming within it, something I couldn't entirely make out. It moved like liquid, swirling in and out of focus. It wasn't my shadow anymore. That thought crashed into me, and I nearly stumbled. It wasn't mine. It had never been. It was something else. A part of me, no, something I had never meant to bring into existence. It was connected to me in some twisted, impossible way, but it wasn't me. I could hear my breath, ragged in my ears. My mind was racing, but nothing made sense. How could something like this exist? How could something that wasn't even real feel so alive? I couldn't stand it anymore. I had to leave. I needed to get outside, away from this, away from whatever this thing was. I pushed past the door and stepped into the hallway. The apartment felt so distant now, so alien. The walls seemed to close in behind me, the shadows still lingering in the corner of my mind, pulling at my every thought. I walked faster, almost running down the stairs, my feet slapping against the cold, concrete steps. But the further I went, the more I felt it, like something was following me. I looked over my shoulder. Nothing. Just the empty stairwell, dimly lit by a single light bulb. But the feeling didn't go away. It was still there, creeping along the edges of my thoughts, haunting every corner of my mind. I reached the bottom of the stairs and pushed through the front door of the building. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, but I didn't care. I needed to be out. I needed to be anywhere but there. But as I stepped into the street, I froze. there, in the dim light of a street lamp, was something I wasn't ready to see. A figure. Tall. Dark. Almost like a person, but wrong. The way it stood there, motionless, watching me. It had no features, no face. Just a shape. A shadow. And I knew, right then, that I couldn't escape. Not from it. Not from my own shadow. I tried to move, to turn away, but my body refused to obey. My feet were glued to the pavement, my legs shaking. The shadow in front of me didn't move, but I could feel it. It was getting closer, inch by inch, pressing in on me like the walls of a nightmare. I tried to scream, but no sound came. The shadow stretched, impossibly long, and then it whispered again. That voice. That terrible, guttural voice. You can't escape. And for the first time, I realized the truth. I wasn't just running from a shadow. I was running from myself. I couldn't breathe. My lungs felt like they were closing in on themselves, suffocating me. Every nerve in my body screamed, telling me to run, but my legs, my own legs, refused to move. They were locked in place, my body betraying me, trapped by some invisible force that seemed to pull me back into that street lamp's flickering light. The shadow in front of me didn't move, but I could feel it pressing in. It was there, just on the edge of my vision, stretching toward me, its shape growing, contorting. I wanted to close my eyes, to pretend it wasn't real, but I couldn't. Something kept me rooted in the present, staring at the dark figure. I wanted to scream, but my mouth felt dry, like I had no voice left. You can't escape, it whispered again, its voice like 1,000 distant whispers all tangled together. The words echoed in my skull, and the air around me thickened. No. No, no, no. I snapped my head to the side, desperate for a way out. But the street around me felt too quiet, too empty. There was nothing but the street lamp casting its weak light across the cracked pavement, the night air that felt colder with every passing second. Why didn't anyone else see it? I could barely hold my thoughts together, let alone piece together what was happening. This thing, this shadow, wasn't just a trick of the light. It had substance. I could feel it, pressing on me like a weight on my chest. It was alive in a way that made my stomach churn. My head snapped back toward the shadow. It was closer now, too close, its form stretching longer as it reached for me. My heart pounded so loudly I thought it might burst. The cold, the dark, the thing, it was all too much. The weight in the air felt unbearable, suffocating, like the very world was collapsing around me. I tried to move again, but my feet stayed glued to the ground. You can't escape, it said again, this time so close, so real, I could feel its breath, or was it my own? It was growing. It was growing closer. I closed my eyes, squeezing them shut, praying it would just stop, praying that somehow, some way, this nightmare would end. But when I opened them, it was still there. I saw its shape, shifting, changing with the flickering light. And then, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A hand. A hand, not mine. It reached out from the darkness, coming from the very shadow itself. A black, claw-like thing that stretched far too long, too unnatural. It was reaching for me. I stumbled backward, finally breaking free from the paralysis that had gripped me. My feet hit the pavement, and I started running faster than I ever had before, pushing my body forward, away from the shadow. My breath came in ragged gasps, and my chest burned with every step. But the shadow was always there. It was chasing me, always just one step behind, its elongated form stretching across the ground, following my every move. I could hear its whispers again. Closer now, clearer. They weren't words anymore, but sounds, grating, guttural noises that slithered into my brain, making my thoughts unravel. The closer I got to the end of the street, the harder it was to breathe, the more the air pressed in on me. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, was suffocating. Every step I took, I felt the shadow getting closer, closing in like a vice. Please, please. I ran harder. My legs screamed at me, but I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. Not until I was out of its reach, not until I was away from the thing that was attached to me. But as I reached the corner of the street, something stopped me. A reflection. It was the sidewalk. For the briefest moment, I caught a glimpse of myself. No, not myself. It was the shadow of me, but somehow different. It stretched out in front of me, its form jagged and monstrous, reaching up, twisting and distorting. And then I saw it. My own shadow didn't match my movements. It was moving on its own. No, not moving, reaching. It was no longer just a dark shape. It was becoming something else. It was becoming alive. I screamed. I screamed because I knew what was happening, and I knew I couldn't stop it. The shadow wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was part of me, but not in the way I had ever understood. It was feeding on my fear, on my confusion, and it was growing stronger with every moment. I ran faster, my legs burning, but I could hear it now. The sound of footsteps behind me, echoing, matching my own, but too fast, too close. I dared to glance behind me and saw the figure. It wasn't just the shadow anymore. It was something. It was real. It had a body now, or something like it. The shape of a man, but twisted. The limbs were wrong, unnaturally long. The face, there was no face, just a void where one should be. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. It was coming for me. The shadow had become real. I collapsed to the ground, but I couldn't get up. My body was trembling, my mind breaking down under the weight of what I was seeing. And then it reached for me. A hand, impossibly long, stretched out, its fingers reaching through the darkness. My mind screamed at me to run, but my body wouldn't obey. The hand touched me. I felt it. It wasn't cold. It wasn't warm. It was empty, like being touched by a void. And then it whispered again. The words, so close, they felt like they were inside my skull. You're mine. The last thing I heard before everything went black was the sound of my own voice. Screaming. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.